too old, too slow, and too stupid to know when you're out of your depth. That is what Dr. Sterling said 47 minutes before Black Hawks landed in Sacred Heart's parking lot, demanding Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh by name. But at this moment, Margaret stands at the ICU nurse's station under fluorescent lights that buzz and flicker like dying insects, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her scrubs spotless despite 15 years on these floors. She checks medication logs with handwriting so precise it could be printed by machine, each dosage verified twice, each timestamp exact. Around her, the hospital moves in its controlled chaos, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, ventilators wheeze their mechanical song, residents rushing past in their white coats like they own the corridors. They don't see her. Margaret had started at Sacred Heart in Norfolk when she was 32 years old with a new identity and a lie about her background. She'd said she had 15 years of nursing experience. It was true. She'd said nothing about where those 15 years came from. That was the point. In her locker on the 3rd floor, folded into a plastic bag beneath her spare shoes, sits a flag. American flag. It's the one they drape over coffins. This one had draped over her teammates, a man named Rodriguez, Delta operator, 2 kids back in San Antonio. She'd carried that flag in her rucksack for 13 years. Never unfolded it. Never let anyone see it. The weight of it had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. A thin scar runs along her right forearm, barely visible unless you know to look. Unless you know what shrapnel looks like after it heals. Most people at Sacred Heart think she cut herself on something in her kitchen years ago. They don't ask. She doesn't offer. She moves through these corridors like a ghost, present, essential, invisible. Patients request her by name. 73-year-old Mr. Hernandez in Bay 4 asks for Margaret every shift. Mrs. Chen in the corner bed holds Margaret's hand during her cardiac monitoring and says, "You're the only one who doesn't make me feel like I'm dying." The day shift supervisor, Ron Martinez, a former Marine Corps medic, watches Margaret work and shakes his head sometimes, like he recognizes something in the precise economy of her movements, the way she anticipates what a patient needs before they ask. But the doctors barely acknowledge her existence. Dr. Sterling watches from the doctor's lounge with a lip curled like a dog that's caught a scent it despises. He sees competence without credentials. Respect without status. He sees a nurse whose instincts move faster than his textbooks can account for, and it burns him the way nothing else in his life has burned him. Sterling is the kind of doctor who believes hierarchy is intelligence, that his medical degree is a permission slip to dismiss anyone in scrubs. He is competent enough to be dangerous and arrogant enough to believe that competence is the same as wisdom. They are not the same thing. Margaret has known this for 23 years. Sterling is 48 years old, inherited money that made his first apartment in Manhattan possible, a medical degree from Johns Hopkins that his father had endowed a wing to support, and a persona built entirely on the architecture of never being questioned. His watch costs $12,000. His shoes are Italian leather. He drives a Range Rover with vanity plates that read Sterling 1. When he walks into a room, he expects people to rearrange themselves around him. Mostly, they do. Margaret does not. This morning, Sterling had ordered a medication change for a patient, a switch from metoprolol to verapamil without checking the patient's current calcium channel blocker regimen. Margaret had asked, quietly, if he'd reviewed the contraindication. Not in a way that challenged him. Just a question. Just the kind of thing a nurse with actual experience asks. The look he'd given her had been contemptuous. Like she'd suggested he was illiterate. 47 minutes ago, he'd found her at the medication station, restocking 4 bags, and he'd said it loud enough for the interns to hear. Loud enough for 3 other nurses to hear. Loud enough that the words had hung in the air like toxic gas. Too old, too slow, and too stupid to know when you're out of your depth. Margaret had not flinched. She had not blinked. She had set down the 4 bag with the same care she'd use placing an infant in a crib. She had turned to face him with eyes the color of concrete after rain, flat, cold, impossible to read. And she had said, in a voice that came from someplace deeper than her chest, a place that had survived things Sterling couldn't imagine. "I've seen better men than you break under less pressure than this." Then she had turned back to her work. Sterling's face had gone the color of old meat. His hands had trembled, like a leaf in wind, like a child waiting for punishment. The interns had looked away. The other nurses had suddenly found urgent work to do in other parts of the ICU. For exactly 3 seconds, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors and the hiss of a ventilator pushing air into resistant lungs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't made it dramatic or accusatory. She'd simply stated a fact, the way a surgeon states the findings of pathology, neutral, clinical, irrefutable. She'd moved past him like he was furniture. And Sterling had realized, in that moment, that she was not afraid of him. That he had tried for weeks to make her afraid and it had not worked. Margaret had been at Sacred Heart for 15 years. Before that, a life she did not discuss. Before that, a rank she did not mention. Before that, 17 deployments to Bagram and locations that weren't on any official map. Before that, the kind of training that teaches you to assess threats the way other people assess weather. Before that, a version of herself that no longer existed in any government database, because the army had erased her from those databases 13 years ago. A gunnery sergeant doesn't just leave Special Operations Command. A gunnery sergeant is usually extracted, debriefed, paid off through a series of accountants, and then permitted to disappear. Margaret had disappeared. She'd become a nurse in Norfolk, Virginia, in a city where no one knew her name, where no one asked questions, where she could save lives without the weight of classified operations or the knowledge that the people she was saving might be enemies dressed in hospital gowns and handcuffs. For 13 years, it had worked. She knew the hospital's protocols better than the administration. She knew dosing calculations that would make most pharmacists weep. She knew the particular way a patient's breathing changed in the 3 minutes before cardiac arrest, a shallow, desperate pattern that most nurses learned from textbooks but Margaret had learned from the sound of dying men in desert tent cities. She could start and fall with the kind of speed and accuracy that made the residents watch her like she was performing magic. The difference between a competent nurse and a legendary one was invisible. It was in the small decisions, the early interventions, the ability to know when something was wrong before the machines told you so. Dr. Sterling despised her for this. Because Sterling had spent his entire life believing that intelligence was a credential. And Margaret Walsh moved through the world like someone who'd learned that intelligence is a burden you carry in your muscles and your instincts and your ability to stay still when everything inside you is screaming to act. She was 63 years old. She'd been a nurse for 30 years, if you counted the work she couldn't discuss. Silver hair. Scarred hands. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The patients loved her because she touched them with the gentle precision of someone who understood pain was information, was data to be read and interpreted, not something to be scolded for reporting. The residents respected her, though they didn't always know why. The attending physicians mostly ignored her except when they needed something from her that she could deliver without breaking protocol. And Dr. Sterling hated her? He had been building something for weeks now, a file of her perceived infractions, small moments where she'd questioned his orders or anticipated his diagnostic conclusions. He was the type of man who could not tolerate being outpaced by someone he'd been trained to dismiss. He was the type of man who believed his white coat was a crown, and everyone else in the hospital was simply staff. So he was planning something. Margaret had seen it in the way he watched her, the way his eyes lingered on her badge like he was calculating how to make it disappear. What he didn't know was that Margaret had been watched by people far more dangerous than him. She had been trained by people who understood leverage in ways Sterling's shallow mind would never grasp. She had survived things that would make his carefully constructed world collapse like a card tower in a hurricane. But she said nothing. She simply worked. She checked her medication logs. She moved from room to room. She held patients' hands and listened to their fears and delivered the kind of presence that made people believe they would survive the night. And she waited. Because waiting was something Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh had learned to do better than almost anyone alive. The overhead page crackled at 2:17 p.m., and Margaret froze mid-stride. Grandma Walsh to ICU bed 7. Grandma Walsh, ICU 7. The words hung in the air like smoke. Every head on the floor turned. Nurses exchanged glances. Someone bit back a smile. Sterling stood in the ICU doorway, his arms crossed, watching her reaction the way a predator watches prey decide whether to run. Margaret's jaw tightened, a single muscle contraction, barely visible, but she didn't pause. She walked toward the bed with her spine straight and her hand steady, moving through the whispers like they were rain she'd learned long ago not to acknowledge. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent witnesses to a small cruelty delivered in front of 12 people. Sterling's smirk followed her, satisfied that he'd finally gotten a reaction, even if it was only in her shoulders, only in the way she gripped the patient's chart a fraction too hard. That night, alone in her apartment, Margaret replayed it. Not the insult. The insult was noise. What bothered her was that he was escalating, testing boundaries, learning how far he could push before something broke. She'd seen men like Sterling before, men who mistook gentleness for weakness, who equated the ability to be kind with the inability to fight back. Men who'd learned too late that the quietest people in the room often knew exactly how many ways there were to end a problem. She made coffee at 11 o'clock and sat by the window, watching Norfolk rain hammer the parking lot, her hands wrapped around the mug like it was a thing that needed holding. The supply closet attack came 2 days later. Margaret was reaching for a stack of fresh linens when Sterling slammed the door behind her, cutting off the hallway light. The smell of antiseptic and cardboard filled the small space. His voice came low and tight, the kind of controlled anger that made it worse than shouting. "You questioned my dosage order in front of the residents," he said, stepping closer. The closet was barely 8 feet deep. She could feel the heat off his body, the coffee on his breath, the tremor in his voice that wasn't fear, it was rage barely contained. "I don't care how many patients kiss your ass. I don't care how many thank you cards are taped to your locker. You are a nurse. You follow orders or you lose your license. I will personally see to it. One phone call and you're done. Finished. Do you understand me?" Margaret listened. Her face remained carved from stone, no flinch, no retreat, no quickening of breath. Her hands didn't shake. The fluorescent light from under the door cast a pale line across her cheekbones. When Sterling finished, when his breathing had turned ragged and his jaw had clenched so hard she could see the muscle working, she delivered her response with the precision of someone who'd been trained to kill men with her bare hands and had instead chosen to spend 15 years saving lives. Her voice came out flat. Glacial. I've seen better men than you break under less pressure than this. She stepped toward the door. Sterling moved aside, not because she asked him to, but because something in the way she moved made it clear that if he didn't, she would move him. She walked past him into the hallway, leaving him trembling in the dark closet, his hands clenched into fists that had nowhere to go. The third humiliation was public. Intentionally so. Sterling orchestrated it during the shift change at 7:45 p.m., when the night shift was arriving and the day shift was gathering in the hallway to give report. 12 nurses, 2 residents, a charge nurse. He called Margaret over, his voice casual and carrying, the voice of a man who'd already won. Effective immediately, he announced, holding up a printed assignment sheet, Walsh is reassigned to bedpan duty. Insubordination has consequences. Maybe manual labor will remind you of your place in the hierarchy. The words landed like stones. Margaret took the paper from his hand without looking at him. Her eyes scanned the shift assignment, the date stamp, the clinical language of institutional punishment. Around her, the night shift nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone whispered something. No one moved to defend her. This was how Sterling worked. He made examples, made the cost of loyalty clear, made sure everyone understood that siding with Margaret Walsh meant becoming her. She looked up at Sterling then, and her eyes were the color of a winter ocean, deep, cold, holding depths no one could see into. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that only he heard it, though her body language suggested she was speaking for everyone. The difference between you and a good doctor is that good doctors know what they don't know. She folded the assignment sheet along its crease and walked toward her car, leaving him standing in the hallway holding nothing but air and the sudden understanding that he'd made a mistake. Not in reassigning her. In thinking that public humiliation would break someone who'd already survived things that would kill ordinary people. That night, Sterling began building his paper trail. It was meticulous work, the kind of sabotage that required patience and institutional knowledge. He drafted witness statements, coaching his residents on what to remember, Margaret's tone, her attitude, her constant questioning of orders. He created time-stamped documentation of every minor infraction he could manufacture or retroactively date. He referenced Hospital Policy Code 7.3.2 about nurses exceeding their scope of practice, circling passages, highlighting concerns, making notes in the margins that suggested a pattern of dangerous behavior. Death by 1,000 forms. Death by the bureaucracy she'd spent 15 years serving. He built a case the way an architect builds a house, foundation first, each level supporting the next, until the entire structure was so solid that removing a single brick wouldn't topple it. The John Doe arrived on a Wednesday at 11:43 p.m. The paramedics wheeled him through the ER doors at a jog, calling vitals to Sterling, who was covering the emergency room and immediately began issuing orders with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine from textbooks and had never learned humility from consequences. CT head, C spine, chest. Type and cross for 6 units. Neuro checks every 15 minutes. The patient was a man in his mid-30s, built lean and muscular in a way that suggested years of deliberate physical conditioning. His face was swollen, lips split, but his eyes tracked the movement in the room with an alertness that survived trauma. Margaret took his vitals while the trauma team cut away his clothing. His chest was bruised purple, 3 ribs broken by the impact, his breathing shallow but present. Pupils sluggish but reactive. No wallet. No phone. No identification. Just a man with no name, no documented history, no proof he'd ever existed. As Margaret bagged his bloody shirt for evidence, something metallic fell from the torn fabric and hit the tile floor with a clink. Dog tags. She picked them up, the metal warm from his skin, and read the stamped name and unit with the precision of someone who could decipher every piece of information encoded there. 75th Ranger Regiment. Blood type O negative. Service number. She held them for exactly 3 seconds, feeling their weight, understanding what they meant. She glanced at Sterling, who was focused on ordering labs no one needed, his attention elsewhere, and then she slipped the tags into her pocket with the quiet efficiency of muscle memory. The gesture was instinctive, protective, the kind of thing that came from having once lived in a world where names on metal chains meant everything. That night, alone in her apartment with the door locked and the rain hammering against the windows like something trying to get in, Margaret sat on her bed with the dog tags in her open palm. The metal caught what little light came through the window. She read the name again, printed bold in the stamped letters, and then she opened her nightstand drawer and placed the tags next to something she'd carried for 13 years and told no one about. A folded flag. United States Army. Presented to her at Arlington on a day she couldn't quite remember, at a funeral for a man whose name she'd spent 13 years learning to forget. She closed the drawer and sat in the dark, listening to the rain, wondering if this stranger knew what it meant to be erased. The Ranger stabilized over the next 2 days. His vitals improved in the way vitals improve when someone's body decides it wants to keep living. The scans came back clear of internal bleeding. His ribs would mend. His concussion would fade. By Friday afternoon, Sterling had already discharged him from ICU to the ward. His attention moved on to more acute cases, his interest in this nameless man exhausted. But Margaret checked on him every shift, once in the morning before Sterling arrived, once at night after he left. She watched the monitors, noting the subtle improvements in his oxygen saturation, the way his heart rate stabilized, the small signs that meant the trauma was resolving. She never spoke to him beyond taking vitals. She never asked his name. But when he was asleep, she stood in the doorway and watched him breathe, this ranger whose identity she held in her pocket, whose erasure from the world made sense in ways she'd stopped trying to explain to civilians years ago. And then, on Saturday morning at 6:02 a.m., before the shift change, before Sterling arrived, her phone rang. The phone call came at 6:48 a.m., Saturday morning, before the shift change, before Sterling arrived. Margaret stood in the break room holding her cold coffee, and the voice on the other end, a male, clipped, military, said only, "Is he stable?" She didn't ask who was calling. She already knew. Room for 12. ICU. Monitored. The line went dead. She stood there for another 3 seconds, then walked back to the floor. The Ranger was sleeping when she checked on him at 6:15 a.m. His name was etched on the dog tag still hidden in her scrub pocket, Sergeant Dylan Cavanaugh, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. 26 years old. The tags had been tangled in his bloody shirt when he arrived Thursday night, covered in glass and asphalt from the Highway 64 collision. A drunk driver had T-boned his truck doing 70 miles per hour. The Ranger walked away with 3 fractured ribs, a lacerated spleen that she'd watched the trauma surgeon repair, and what seemed like a miraculous recovery. Seemed. That was the word that would matter in about 8 minutes. At 6:22 a.m., Margaret noticed his skin. Grey. Ash grey, like someone had drained the color from him in the last 4 hours. She moved closer. His neck veins were distended, swollen like ropes pulling taut against the skin. His blood pressure had been 128/82 at the last check, 2 hours ago. Now the monitor read 94/58 and the line was moving downward like a slow-motion crash. Margaret's hands didn't move. She just watched the numbers drop. 92, 88, 84. The heart rate compensating, racing to push volume that wasn't being pumped efficiently. Tachycardia. The body's desperate math when something was breaking inside. She checked his breathing. Shallow. Fast. 32 breaths a minute when normal was 16. The ventilator wasn't on, he was breathing on his own, which meant his lungs knew the problem wasn't oxygen. The problem was pressure. Pressure inside the pericardial sac. Blood filling the space around his heart like water filling a box, crushing the walls, suffocating the organ. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis crystallized in her mind with the precision of someone who had held dying men in desert heat and known exactly what was killing them. She hit the code button. Not a full code, a clinical emergency alert. Within 30 seconds, the charge nurse appeared, then a resident, then Dr. Sterling, who was still holding his coffee, his expression already tight with annoyance at being pulled from rounds. He looked at the monitor, then at Margaret, then at the patient with the expression of a man who had been interrupted during something important. He was stable, Sterling said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Margaret pointed at the monitor with one finger. She didn't speak. The data spoke. Muffled heart sounds on auscultation, she'd already listened 30 seconds ago. Pulsus paradoxus, the blood pressure dropping 10 millimeters of mercury more than normal with inspiration. Beck's triad presenting itself like a textbook chapter come to life. Distended neck veins. Hypertension. Muffled heart sounds. The constellation of symptoms for cardiac tamponade, each one clicking into place like ammunition loading into a magazine. He needs a pericardiocentesis, Margaret said. Now. Or he dies in 5 minutes. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next room, wheeze and hiss, a mechanical metronome of normalcy in a room that was collapsing. Sterling's face reddened, not from fear but from something uglier. Disrespect. Challenge. The threat of a floor nurse telling a doctor what to do. You do not tell me what he needs, he said, his voice low, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than shouting. We wait for the cardiac surgeon. That is protocol. That is what happens when we follow procedure instead of listening to assumptions from the nursing staff. Margaret watched the monitor. Blood pressure 87/56. The Ranger's lips were beginning to take on a blue tint around the edges. Cyanosis. His body was running out of oxygen not because he couldn't breathe, but because his heart couldn't push blood efficiently anymore. The pressure was winning. 8 minutes, maybe less. She'd seen this before. In a convoy outside Bagram, a young operator hit by shrapnel from an IED, blood filling the sac around his heart while they waited for a surgeon who was 30 kilometers away. That operator had died in 9 minutes. Hospital Policy 7.3.2, Sterling continued, pulling the chart closer as if the written rules might protect him from what was happening on the monitor. Nurses do not perform procedures outside their scope of practice. That's a physician's role. That's my role. He was already reaching for the phone. Operator, connect me with Dr. Vasquez, cardiothoracic. Tell him we have a tamponade in ICU room for 12. The operator's voice crackled back, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Margaret did the math her hands already understood. Blood pressure was now 82/50. The ranger's skin was getting paler by the second. O2 saturation dropping. 96 to 94 to 92. The heart couldn't function when it was being crushed. It would stop. Not slow down first, stop. Sudden cardiac arrest from exsanguination into the pericardial sac. 14-gauge angiocath needle, Margaret said quietly. Not as a request. As a statement. 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. Push the needle in at a 90-degree angle. Draw back on the syringe until you see blood, then you know you're in the pericardial fluid. 20 to 30 milliliters and his pressure will come up. Maybe more, depending on how much blood is in there. Sterling turned to look at her. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked afraid. Not of the patient dying. Of what Margaret was doing. Of what she was about to do. Get out, he said. Get off this floor. You are done here. Margaret looked at the monitor. 78/48. The ranger's eyes were starting to flutter like he was fighting to stay conscious. She could see his chest moving in that shallow, rapid rhythm, lungs desperate, heart failing. And she saw something else too. She saw a convoy, dust rising from the road, a 19-year-old private screaming for a medic, bleeding out internally while the clock ticked and the surgeon stayed in the FOB. She saw 12 men that day. 12. And she'd kept 6 of them alive because she didn't wait for permission. The choice took 0 seconds. Military muscle memory didn't negotiate with hospital policy. It just moved. Margaret stepped forward. Sterling moved to block her, but she'd already sidestepped him with a kind of fluid precision that came from years of moving through combat zones without asking which route the commander preferred. She was already pulling supplies. Prep kit. The 14-gauge needle. A 30-milliliter syringe. Her hands moved on their own, steady as surgical steel. The charge nurse tried to speak, but Margaret was already there, already cleaning the ranger's skin with antiseptic that smelled like copper and alcohol and the same operating theaters where she'd learned to keep people alive. The needle went in. She felt the subtle resistance of the pericardial membrane, the thin wall separating the heart from its own blood, and then the give, the penetration into the space where the problem lived. She drew back on the syringe and felt the resistance of blood. Not much. Just enough to confirm. The hiss of air escaped as she began to withdraw the fluid, slow and steady, the way she'd done 1,000 times in a past that had supposedly been erased. The monitor responded immediately. Blood pressure began to climb. 82 to 88 to 94. The heart rate began to slow from its panicked compensation rhythm. 142 to 135 to 118. The ranger's lips shifted from blue back toward pink. O2 saturation climbing. 92 to 94 to 96. Sinus rhythm. Normal, steady, beautiful sinus rhythm. She withdrew 38 milliliters of blood from around his heart and set the syringe down on the metal tray. The room was completely silent except for the heartbeat on the monitor, steady, strong, alive. Sterling was standing 3 feet away, his face the color of old paper. The charge nurse was holding her breath. The resident looked like he'd just watched someone walk on water. "He's stable," Margaret said. She set the needle down and peeled off her gloves. "Cardiac surgeon can take it from here." She didn't wait for Sterling to respond. She turned and walked toward the break room, and nobody moved to stop her. Behind her, the ranger's monitor continued its steady beep-beep-beep rhythm, the sound of a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of death by a floor nurse with a hidden rank and a past that the Pentagon had buried 13 years ago. Margaret sat in the break room with her cold coffee and stared at the wall. Her phone was already vibrating in her pocket. She didn't look at it yet. She just sat there, perfectly composed, perfectly still, and knew that everything was about to change. The dog tags in her pocket felt heavier than they had before, weighted with something that wasn't just metal and memory. They were weighted with consequence. The third morning, Margaret entered the ranger's room at 6:15 a.m. during the quiet hour when the ICU held its breath. The moment she saw him, she knew. Grey skin. Distended jugular veins that stood out like rope beneath his jaw. His chest rising in shallow, panic gasps. Blood pressure monitor reading 78/52 and dropping. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac around his heart had filled with blood from the ruptured vessel no one had caught during surgery. The fluid was compressing his heart like a fist closing, strangling it, drowning it from the inside. He had maybe minutes. Margaret's voice didn't change. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. I need the crash cart. Now." Nurses scattered. Alarm screamed. And then Dr. Sterling arrived, still holding his coffee, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that looked like panic when he saw the monitor. 76. 74. The numbers dropping like a stone down a well. "Get a cardiac surgeon up here," Sterling barked into his phone. "I don't care if he's in surgery. I need him now." 20 minutes, the operator's voice crackled back. "He's in the OR." 20 minutes. The ranger had 4. Margaret moved to the crash cart and pulled the pericardiocentesis kit. Needle. Syringe. Chlorhexidine swabs. Her hands moved on their own, guided by muscle memory older than this hospital, older than this city, muscle memory from 3 tours in Bagram where she'd done this exact procedure on soldiers bleeding to death in convoy ambushes, where speed meant the difference between walking out or being carried out. "What are you doing?" Sterling's voice cracked. "Step away from that patient." Margaret didn't answer. She prepped the subxiphoid area with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and chemical. The ranger's eyes went wide, his hand reaching for her, his mouth forming words he couldn't quite push out. "I'm right here," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "You're going to be fine." Sterling's voice rose. "I am ordering you to step away from that patient. Immediately. That is a direct order. I am calling security. You do not have the authority to perform an invasive procedure. You are a floor nurse." A floor nurse. Other nurses appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. They watched. They didn't move. Margaret inserted the needle at a 45-degree angle beneath the xiphoid process, advancing slowly through the tough fascia of the pericardium. There the subtle give. The needle was in. Dark blood filled the syringe. 60 milliliters. The pericardial fluid draining like poison from a wound. The monitor changed. Blood pressure climbed. 78 became 84, 84 became 92. The heart sounds returned, muffled at first, then clear. The ranger gasped, actually gasped, his lungs filling, his body remembering what oxygen felt like. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, steady sinus rhythm. Sterling went very quiet. He set his coffee cup down on a rolling tray. He turned and walked out of the room without another word, and Margaret knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd survived 18 years of reading the room, that everything that came next had already been decided. that some men could only handle being shown up in front of an audience for so long before they started burning things down. By 9 a.m., Sterling had filed an incident report citing her for practicing medicine without a license, invoking Hospital Policy Code 7.3.2 regarding nurses exceeding scope of practice. By noon, he'd built a documentation trail as methodical as an artillery strike. Witness statements, 3 of them, all conveniently coached, stating Margaret had repeatedly ignored direct orders and demonstrated a pattern of insubordination that endangered patient safety. Time-stamped notes in the chart emphasizing her unauthorized procedure. A formal complaint to the State Nursing Board submitted with CCIT emails to administration. The hospital administrator called her into his office at 2:51 p.m. He looked tired. He slid a suspension notice across his desk. "Effective immediately," he said quietly. "Pending investigation by the State Board." Margaret picked up the paper. She'd served 3 tours in a combat zone. She'd held dying men's hands. She'd made peace with disappearing from the world. A suspension notice was almost gentle by comparison. "Your badge," he said. She unhooked it from her pocket and set it on his desk. The plastic caught the fluorescent light. Sacred Heart Hospital. Margaret Walsh, RN. Issued 2008. 14 years of 12-hour shifts, of holding the line between chaos and care, of being the one the doctors called at 3 a.m. when they needed someone who knew how to think. From his office window, Sterling watched her leave. Arms crossed. The small smile of a man who'd finally drawn blood. That night, Margaret found herself in an all-night diner on the edge of the city at 3 a.m., the kind of place where insomniacs and the newly unemployed gathered like ghosts. She sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee that went cold in a chipped ceramic mug, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with the same mechanical monotony as the ICU. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window, pale, hollow, barely recognizable. The dog tags were heavy in her scrub pocket. So heavy. She pulled them out and laid them on the table, the chain coiled like a snake. The metal was cold. The engravings were worn smooth from years of being worn against someone's chest, the kind of wear that comes from deployment after deployment, from never taking them off because you never knew when you wouldn't come back. She thought about the Ranger waking up tomorrow, breathing easy, the tamponade drained, his life extended by 7 minutes of procedure that shouldn't have happened but had. She thought about the interrogation program Congress would have investigated if anyone had known the truth. She thought about the 12 operators saved in the ambush outside Bagram, the ones whose names she'd never been allowed to say, whose families believed she was dead. And she wondered, in that quiet, glacial voice that lived in the part of her that had survived 2 decades without anyone knowing her name, if it had been worth it. If erasing Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh from every Pentagon database meant she got to be nobody. Nobody could hurt. Nobody would recognize. Nobody to answer to. Just a nurse. Just a woman pushing a mop, holding a patient's hand, disappearing into the background noise of the hospital like she was part of the infrastructure. But that meant staying erased. That meant never existing again. Never standing. Never speaking her name out loud because her name wasn't supposed to be heard. The kind of invisibility that felt like drowning in slow motion, one shift at a time. The clock on the diner wall read 3:02 a.m. Outside, Norfolk was asleep. Inside, Margaret sat with cold coffee and dog tags and the weight of a choice she'd made 13 years ago that had just come due. She had no way of knowing that 72 hours from this moment, the sound would come. The sound came at 6:38 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, a sound Margaret had heard only twice before in her life, both times on dusty airfields 13 years in her past. The rotor wash shook the Sacred Heart parking lot like thunder locked in a box, and 2 UH-60 Blackhawks descended through the grey Norfolk sky with the terrifying precision of predators that had already decided where they were landing. She didn't know they were coming. She was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when the first nurse stuck her head through the swinging doors and said, "There are military helicopters outside. Right now." The doors burst open. A full-bird colonel stepped into the administrator's office with 3 subordinates flanking him like shadows that had learned to walk upright. His uniform carried the particular worn dignity of a man who had slept in tents and sand, whose voice carried the weight of command decisions that couldn't be unmade. The administrator stood. Dr. Sterling was in the hallway watching through the window, his arms crossed, and in the space of 8 seconds his face transformed from arrogance to something closer to bone-deep terror. The colonel didn't introduce himself. He simply spoke into the silence like a man accustomed to his words moving mountains. "I need to speak with Gunnery Walsh. Now." The administrator's face went pale. "I'm sorry, who?" "Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh. Your floor nurse. The one you suspended 36 hours ago for saving a patient's life." The colonel's voice was soft, which made it somehow more lethal. "That patient is standing in the parking lot next to my helicopter. He'd like to thank her." "So would I." Sterling's hands unclenched. Then clenched again. His jaw worked like a hinge that had forgotten how to move properly. The administrator was reaching for his phone when the ranger walked in, the same man Margaret had pulled back from the edge of cardiac arrest 3 days earlier, his color restored, his breathing steady, his presence moving through the office like something that had no intention of being ignored. He looked at Sterling and then at the colonel. "Her real name is Margaret Walsh," the ranger said, his voice level and certain. "Gunnery Sergeant, Army Special Operations. She was classified black until 3 days ago when she saved my life. Her name doesn't exist in any public database because she wasn't supposed to. But she does now. And I'm here to make sure everyone knows why." The chaplain stepped forward next, carrying a file folder stamped with the kind of red marks that made government employees stop asking questions. She opened it with the practiced solemnity of someone who had read these words over fallen soldiers. "Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh. 3 tours, Bagram Airfield, 2007 to 2010. Attached to Task Force Ranger, Charlie Squadron. 2 Bronze Stars for Valor. Purple Heart. Commendations for Advanced Trauma Medicine Under Fire. And a commendation for an operation on November 14, 2008, that was buried so deep that it required presidential authorization to unclassify." The admiral entered last, a woman with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, whose stars caught the fluorescent light like warnings. She carried a second file, thicker than the first. Gunnery Sergeant Walsh was the medic attached to a convoy that was ambushed near Sanjin Valley. 12 operators went down. All 12 of them made it home because of her decisions and her hands. The CIA requested she be disappeared from every database because the operation involved enhanced interrogation techniques. Congress investigated those programs 2 years later. The operators would have been exposed as witnesses. So instead, your nurse here spent 13 years erased from existence, working trauma in a civilian hospital, asking for nothing, telling nobody, just saving lives the way she was trained to do. Sterling had backed into the corner by now, his white coat suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit. The ranger looked at him directly. "If she'd waited for your surgical team, I'd be in a flag-draped box. She didn't wait. That's called competence. That's called heroism. I don't understand why you tried to destroy her for it." The admiral turned to the administrator. "You suspended her for practicing medicine without a license. Because she performed a pericardiocentesis." The admiral's smile was not kind. "Do you know what a pericardiocentesis is, administrator?" "A needle to drain fluid from around the heart. A life-saving procedure that requires immediate action when a patient is in cardiac tamponade. A procedure that literally every combat medic learns because waiting for bureaucratic permission means watching your patient die on the table. Your nurse did exactly what she was trained to do by the United States Army. And your doctor filed a complaint because his ego couldn't handle being outmaneuvered by a floor nurse." The admiral paused. "That complaint is being withdrawn. Her suspension is being lifted. And your hospital is going to issue a formal apology." Sterling tried to speak. The colonel looked at him with the kind of gaze that could cut steel. "Doctor, if I were you, I wouldn't move. We're not finished with the paperwork on your end yet. That night, Ron Martinez, the hospital's IT specialist and a Marine Corps veteran, was reviewing system logs for a routine security audit when he noticed something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Someone had accessed the security footage from the ICU trauma bay, the recording that contained the Ranger's code blue and Margaret's emergency procedure. 20 minutes after accessing the file, that person had attempted to delete it. Then again. And again. 9 deletion attempts in 12 minutes. Ron's hands went very still. He'd set up redundant backups after a ransomware attack 6 months ago, the kind of automatic safety net that corporate never asked for and usually nobody remembered existed. He pulled up the external server. Everything was there. Every frame. Every timestamp. Ron downloaded the entire sequence, the footage showing Margaret's steady hands, the procedure, the moment Sterling had tried to push into the trauma bay and Margaret had turned to him with a voice like glacial ice, "Step back." The timestamps of each deletion attempt marched across the screen in a pattern that told the entire story. Ron burned everything to an encrypted drive, labeled it with Sterling's name and nothing else, and walked it into the administrator's office at 7:15 a.m. the next morning. "You need to see this," Ron said. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who had been trained to follow a chain of command and knew exactly how to speak to power. "And you need to call your lawyers." The investigation began before noon. Within 6 hours, Sterling's medical license was suspended pending a full review. The state medical board opened a case. The hospital's legal team drafted responses. Sterling's attempts to destroy evidence, the paper trail he'd weaponized so carefully, the bureaucratic machine he'd wielded like a scalpel, turned into a weapon that cut the other direction. The system he'd trusted to protect him instead documented every move he'd made against a patient's welfare and a decorated veteran's reputation. The irony was almost beautiful. Almost. 6 months passed. Margaret heard through hospital gossip that Dr. Sterling was teaching CPR classes at a community college somewhere in Richmond, drawing minimum wage and no benefits, his medical license suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of his state review. The news arrived to her the way most news did, as background conversation in a break room, something people mentioned and then moved past. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No vindication. No triumph. Just the flat, quiet closure of something that had been broken and then fixed. Sterling belonged to yesterday now. He was barely worth the energy of remembering. She was too busy being alive. Margaret stood in her neat apartment, a one-bedroom in a quiet part of Norfolk, nothing fancy, the walls the color of good sense, and carefully unfolded the flag from her fallen teammate's coffin. The same flag she'd carried for 13 years. The same flag she'd wrapped around herself in dark moments when the weight of erasure got too heavy to carry alone. The stars were still crisp against the blue field, the fold still precise from military funeral ceremony. She held it up to the light and then, with both hands steady, secured it into the triangular display case she'd ordered from a woodworker who understood what flags meant. The case went on her bedroom wall. Below it, she placed the dog tags, not her own, but the Ranger's, which he'd pressed into her palm 2 weeks after his discharge. His hands had been shaking. Hers had not. "You gave me my life back," he'd said. 8 words exactly. "Take these." She'd tried to refuse. He'd pressed her hand closed around them and walked out of her life knowing she would keep them the way soldiers keep promises. Her badge from Sacred Heart sat on the dresser, reinstated with a formal letter of apology and a job offer to train trauma nurses in advanced life support and emergency procedures. She'd turned down the administrative position. Too much paperwork. Too much distance from the work. Instead, she requested assignment back to the ICU floor, the same place where she'd spent 15 years becoming invisible. The hospital had granted it immediately. Apparently, competence was no longer questionable when the Pentagon vouched for it. Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Walsh existed again in official records. Her service history had been restored. Her medals were catalogued. Her name appeared in databases where it had been deleted. The erasure was over. The ghost was solid again, at least on paper. But in the ICU hallways under flickering fluorescent lights that hummed like trapped electricity, she remained exactly what she had always been. Just Margaret. The silver-haired nurse with steady hands and a flat cold stare that cut deeper than any insult. The one patients requested by name. The one doctors learned to listen to whether they wanted to or not. The invisible woman who had always seen everything. She walked through Sacred Heart at dawn the next morning, pushing a medication cart with the same precise efficiency she'd always used, and passing Dr. Chen at the nurse's station. Chen looked up, nodded, not the dismissive nod of before, but the careful, respectful acknowledgement of someone who had learned to see what had always been in front of him. The ranger's old room was occupied by someone else now. Life moved forward. Code blues arrived and departed. People healed and sometimes didn't. The hospital did what hospitals do. But something had changed in the atmosphere, something subtle and pervasive like the shift in air pressure before a storm. The doctors moved with slightly more caution around the floor. The younger nurses watched Margaret like students watching a master class. And when the next code arrived, when the alarm screamed and the crash cart raced through doors, everyone knew exactly who was in charge, even if she never raised her voice above a conversational tone. She was standing by a patient's bedside at 11 p.m. that night, checking the fall line, when a young nurse named Sarah whispered something that nearly made her smile. "Is it true? Are you really?" "A nurse," Margaret said simply. "That's all you need to know. Anything else doesn't matter." She paused. "Well, almost anything else." Sarah nodded and left. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, in an office with a window overlooking the parking lot, people were still talking. Still wondering. Still trying to piece together the story of the woman they'd overlooked for so long. And Margaret was fine with that. Some stories didn't need to be fully told. Some truths were better shown than explained. And some warriors found their greatest strength not in revelation, but in returning to the work that had never stopped mattering. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. The monitors beeped their rhythm. The night shift moved forward like it always did. And Margaret Walsh, Gunnery Sergeant, walked these halls with her spine straight and her hand steady, and the knowledge that heroes sometimes wear scrubs, sometimes work in the dark, and sometimes spend 13 years waiting for the world to catch up to what they'd always known was true about themselves. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, please like this video and subscribe. If you think Margaret deserved better than she got, comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you know someone who's been invisible for too long, share this. Because sometimes the people saving lives work where nobody's looking. See you next time.